Hey y'all, what is going on? What is going on? It's your girl, Melba Pearson, Melba for Miami, Melba for Justice, and it is time for another Mondays with Melba. Well, we're going to dive right in because we have got a lit session this evening. But before we do, I just number one want to center the people of Ukraine for what being invaded by this autocrat dictator crazy person. Nobody should have to not feel safe in their own homes and have bombs being dropped on them. I also want to center the African and Caribbean students who did go to the Ukraine and Russia to study, thinking it was going to be a more economical option than to come to the West, and unfortunately are now finding themselves stuck in that conflict and unable to home. So I would just ask for everyone to keep them in your thoughts and prayers as well. All right, so the topic today is a hot one, critical race theory. And I brought in an absolute expert, my forever woman crush Wednesday, because she is the bomb.com and she'd just be running things. So Dr. Tameka Hobbs, welcome to Mondays with Melba. Please introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background, your writings, and your expertise.
Absolutely. And the feeling is mutual. You are just so fabulous, so brilliant. My heart skipped a beat when you invited me. So thank you again for the opportunity. But for everyone watching, my name is Dr. Tameka Hobbs. I have the privilege of serving as Associate Provost for Academic Affairs at Florida Memorial University in Miami Gardens. In addition to that, I'm Associate Professor of History. I am by training a student of African American history with a specific focus in lynching and racial violence. I published back in 2015 my book, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida with the University Press of Florida. That has won a few awards. I'm excited about that work and the fact that it documents some of these travesties that have taken place here in our state. And then most recently, I have been the founding director of the Social Justice Institute at Florida Memorial University, where we seek to leverage the intellectual and human capital of the university in service to dismantling racial injustice and social inequality. Outside of that, I also have had the privilege for the last 5 years of working with the South Florida People of Color, which is a collaborative group of anti-racist educators. I now am serving as the chair of the board of directors with that group, and have been thrilled to see how that work has really burgeoned since 2015 to help people really understand what is in the really at debate today, racism, and how they can be a part of moving our country towards being more inclusive and more equitable.
Awesome. Awesome. And thank you for all of that because you've really been on the front lines of making sure our community stays educated. And I know the South Florida People of Color, that's a whole other episode that I need to bring you and Ronnie on to really talk about that, because that is a whole other amazing body of work that folks really need to be aware of. So stay tuned for that. Tameka, can you tell us, first of all, can you define what is critical race theory? Because folks got all kinds of definitions. I don't think any of them are right.
When I think about critical race theory, I think about a method of examining the social and legal construction of racism in our country. And it comes from some brilliant legal minds. We think about Derek Bell as really kind of one of the founders. Kimberly Crenshaw is another name that we hear often in the media, and she's done incredible work. There are dozens of other scholars who have been at the forefront of this critical race theory as a body of knowledge for many years. And it has many tangents now when we look at whiteness studies and other types of studies that exist in academia. But it's been incredibly important for me because what I see when I think about critical race theory is these brilliant scholars who've done the work to help us to understand the DNA of white privilege and how it's constructed. Some of the ideas that come out of critical race theory is that race is a social construct. And we know this to be true because scientists have proven through the decoding of the human genome that there are not much difference biologically between people who phenotypically look quite different. So that then begs the question, what is the root of our differences? And critical race theory teaches us that the beliefs that we have and the expectations and stereotypes that we hold about different people based on their race or ethnicity are really socially constructed. It's a psychological phenomenon, and it's in the psychology that we begin to understand things like implicit racial bias. And that's a really powerful one. When you are confronted, and especially with Black people, how do you react? And for far too many folks, they react with fear, because in our society, the way that Black people have been depicted for centuries, it has been in such a way that there is an automatic assumption of criminality whenever people are confronted with Black people, and that continues to be a burden that Black folks especially deal with in this society. And of course, it manifests with many different other groups. We can talk about the Latinx experience. We definitely have to talk about the experience of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, so on and so forth. But that really is at the core. And I know for me, as a person who studies the African American experience, I really focus on anti-Blackness as fundamental to so much of what we do. But when it comes to Kimberly Crenshaw, another one of those keywords that's entered the popular mind is intersectionality. It comes from her, the idea that there are multiple layers of social constructs that shape the way that people are able to move through a society. You know, being a Black woman, there's a deal that I have because I'm Black. There's a deal that I have to deal with different constructions because I'm a woman. There are different constructions because of sexual identity, and the list goes on and on. The ultimate effect of this work has been to allow people to come to a better understanding about how racism works in our society. And the most ironic thing about the pushback against critical race theory is that critical race theory itself would have predicted this type of behavior, because white hegemonic power does things to protect itself. And that's what I really read in this most recent attack. It's multi-layered, but what I want our viewers to understand is how absolutely dangerous this is to the fabric of our nation.
So why is it so dangerous? And in one quick backup, like, you don't teach critical race theory in elementary school, right?
No, those are, everything we've described are very complex, concepts they're not taught. But the problem is, and to your point about the opening and asking the question, how to define it, because it is so poorly understood, what you are seeing and are going to see more of is parents, white parents especially, defining simple lessons around Black history as critical race theory. And that's where we really are going to see the problem, because if we allow that to fester, what you're going to have is a rolling back, a pushback against the simple inclusion of factual information about marginalized people in this country. And it deserves an airing. Not telling children about that creates a host of problems that echoes into generations. I'll just talk for a moment about my work with South Florida people of color. As a historian, I have been most surprised by the role that I have had to play. But what I have come to realize over the years is that it's impossible to create an anti-racist society when people don't understand how our country came to be so deeply rooted with these racist beliefs. And you have to do that work. My work around lynching, even here in the state of Florida, and Florida is one of those states that people think is exceptional. You have all the snowbirds who come here and they brought their liberal views from the north. We've done a really good job of promoting our beaches and Disney. And so people tend not to think about Florida as, one of the deep South states with a racial history like Mississippi or like Georgia. But one of the things I lift in my research is that when you look at the likelihood that African Americans had of being lynched during the height of the lynching period, Black folks living in the state of Florida had the highest likelihood of being lynched of any people in the United States.
Mm.
That really changes things. And if you understand those facts, then you have to then extrapolate what was it like for Black people in the state to live under that type of terroristic threat. How were their lives limited? What opportunities were cut away from them, kept away from them? And so you begin to understand the more complicated truth about how things came to be the way they are, as opposed to what most often happens, which is because we don't have a deep understanding of these patterns and the systemic nature of structural and institutional racism, you blame the victims. Black people live in, rundown neighborhoods because they choose to. That's how they like to live. They don't know any better. When in fact, we now know about redlining. Again, thanks to the disciplines of critical race theory and that type of analysis being applied, we can go back and interrogate the legal policies that were put in place that created legalized racial segregation, that limited economic opportunity, the American dream of owning a home for Black folks. And so if you understand the root of those problems, you then can come up with better solutions. Opening pathways for broader and greater home ownership for Black folks and marginalized folks is a way to remedy some of the economic inequality that we still are dealing with in our society. And so that's the real work, and why I am so frustrated by attempts both in the K-20 system and for groups like South Florida People of Color who go in and do DEI work with institutions. There's going to be this silencing. And the ability to silence is yet another form of power that we have to understand.
So, but why all this drama now, right? Like critical race theory has been around for a minute. This is, it didn't just pop up last night. And my understanding of it was that it was always a college level or a law school course, because again, you're looking at systems and policies and laws and landmark cases and how that all intersected with each other, as well as the actions by the Supreme Court, things like that. So why are we having a heart attack? Not we, but why
Yeah.
people
Yeah, the timing is interesting.
now, and we talk about HB7.
Yeah, the timing is very interesting. One of the questions I've been pondering lately is why was there not this brouhaha around Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow? Because that is a book that is fundamentally constructed around critical race theory, but it was embraced by the Obama administration. It was embraced by the Trump administration and some of the works that he's done. I trace it back to a few things. I think when you look at the debates that existed over the removal of Confederate statues in Southern states and the debate that created, that was part of what we saw in Charlottesville back in 2017, which had that tragic result with the death of the murder of Heather Heyer and that neo-Nazi march. But then you fast forward to the 1619 Project and Nicole Hannah-Jones and the work that she did in centralizing as a part of the observance of the 400th anniversary of the first time on record that we know Black people were brought here and made available for sale. That was incredibly disturbing for a lot of people because and again, that is one of the principal tenets of critical race theory, is to center the voices and perspectives of those people who have been marginalized. And I can tell you as a historian of the Black experience, it is a very different look to look at the nation's history through what Black people have experienced. And I think that was incredibly jarring. For some people, it was eye-opening. For others, but I do believe folks began to centralize and really center how dangerous and powerful, how powerfully dangerous that type of perspective was. And so you're going to immediately see President Trump come back with a 1776 commission. You're going to see him issue his proclamation working through the Office of Management and Budget. That was, again, kind of a precursor of some of the legislation we're seeing now, saying that he didn't want federal funds being used for this type of indoctrination. And so there were over 300 contracts that were canceled for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion training at the federal government because of what President Trump was doing. And so I think what we've seen there is just the beginnings of this movement moving forward. But for me too, what we all need to understand about this is more political than anything. As you've already pointed out, Melba, it's a non-issue. CRT is not something that is taught in K-12. Very rarely do you see it being taught explicitly in universities, but they have essentially made a straw man that is incredibly mobilizing for parents. And what you're going to see in many states, in the language of so many of these bills, is an attempt to foment the anger and paranoia among white parents. And get them to action. I was doing some research in Indiana. Their attorney general actually published a 53-page parents' rights guide that is full of mistakes. It's not only full of mistakes in terms of how it defines CRT. It actually calls out by name folks like Nicole Hannah-Jones. And in a statement just declares all of her intellectual work false, which is another very troubling trend that we see here. There's just so many. But what also concerns me as an academician is the ability of politicians to silence and squash intellectual work, primarily by Black scholars, like Nicole Hannah-Jones, like Ibram Kendi, like Robin DiAngelo. Carol Anderson is another one I think we're going to see on that list. She has some very powerful writings. But the ability of these folks just to come down and just to quiet. Yeah, I have her. She's right over my shoulder.
Yeah, she's right here.
She's Women Crush Wednesday also. Yes, Carol Anderson. But yeah, I mean, you think about all of the work that these scholars have done over the years and the recognitions that they received. Ibram Kendi winning the National Book Award. But to have politicians come along and just invalidate you and invalidate your scholarship and have the power to do that at a very high level is another very disturbing and frankly racist trend that needs to be called out for what it is. While I'm into it, the other side of this that's very disturbing for me is all of the parents are white, all of the kids are white. No one is talking about the flip side and the damage that's going to be done to Black children. Really, all children generally are harmed whenever there are these intentional omissions of truth. But the only argument that we see being made is the threat to, and the white is silent. But white parents and white kids. And that's something that also needs to be brought to the forefront. I am of the generation of kids who did not get enough information about Black history in my K-12 education. It wasn't until I went to college, I had my first Black history class at a HBCU, and it helped to contextualize so much of the lives of my parents as folks who had integrated their schools, my grandparents who were sharecroppers who didn't have access to high schools because there were no publicly funded high schools for Black children during the period that they grew up in North Central Florida. And to, even as a 19-year-old, I changed my major from business to history because I just was outraged that people had the right to decide what students could and should not learn. And we've seen some real advancement on that here in the state of Florida, going back to 1994 with the mandated teaching of Black history. But this law now flies in the face of that progress.
Yeah. So, first of all, I definitely want to dive a little bit more into the law. But the other thing is too, and I remember reading this on Twitter from I can't remember who posted this, but they were saying that what about all of the white folks who fought and stood up against slavery and stood up in the civil rights movement? Shouldn't students learn about them as well, right? So it's not like it's, everything is white people's fault. There were brave white people that stood side by side to fight for justice, and shouldn't they have a place in history as well? So by erasing anything about critical race theory, you're also erasing the accomplishments of brave white abolitionists, et cetera, who fought alongside with Black people because they saw, and Indigenous people and others because they saw the wrongs that were happening. But can you talk a little bit more about what HB 7, what kind of impact is going to have, especially when you're talking about the devaluation of expertise?
Yes, I think what I see in HB7 that is especially concerning is this mandate that you can't teach things that are going to hurt people's feelings because of their race or their gender. And anytime you try to mandate what people feel, I think you're going to be on a very, very slippery slope. And so, for me, those are huge red flags. The people who are going to be in the hot seat with this type of legislation, should it be signed into law, and we all expect that it will be, are educators who already are, stretched thin, who have so many things to deal with, who've just, done a tremendous job in trying to bring our children through the pandemic. Now they are going to have to face the ire of these politically charged parents who are going to be pointing fingers at them and accusing them of teaching CRT when all they're doing is trying to include a Black history lesson to teach the standards as they exist in the state of Florida. We've already seen that in Alabama. Alabama is one of these states that have passed their version of this anti-CRT law. And in the month of February, during Black History Month, when the Black history lessons were being taught, there has been a challenge raised by a white parent that there is CRT being taught by the school district. I think that case is a bit of a canary in the coal mine, and we can expect more of that. Our teachers are going to be under a lot of pressure. Our principals are going to be under a great deal of pressure. Our superintendents, our school boards, and it's all because of this politically motivated faux crisis, because it absolutely is not real, and that's really what's so crazy about it.
So, what can we do to fight this? What could the average everyday person do to fight all of this foolishness and this disinformation and all the fallout that's going to come from that?
I kind of put on myself what a people of color hat, and what we talk about as people come to our gatherings and leave our spaces. We charge people that everyone has a role to play in eliminating racism, and that you have to speak up whenever you see it. I've been more of a champion these days of the idea of an anti-racist vote. We talk about active anti-racism, which is, again, getting involved, speaking up, making sure that you are a demonstrable ally in the cause. But one of the ways that you can demonstrate that is by exercising your very precious right to vote. Are you, all of us, evaluating candidates on their values? Is there a commitment to anti-racism on the part of the people that we're electing to office? Or do they have a demonstrated record of being inclusive in their workplaces, or being a champion of inclusion and diversity in their public stances? Are the policies that they are supporting working in favor of the most of us or the few of us? And so that type of query, us raising our voices and letting people know that this is moving in the wrong direction, and if they don't listen to you, making sure that they pay the price of not having the privilege of serving in public office, is something that is very necessary. And I think we're at another one of those critical moments in our history in this country, where we are really going to have to get clear about where we are and what direction we want to move in. Aside from that, when I think about the work within the community, and I speak here primarily among the African American community, I've had the privilege of serving as the founding president of the South Florida branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. That, of course, is an organization that was started by Carter G. Woodson in the 1920s. It's the reason we have Black History Month, which is wrapping up today. But Carter G. Woodson and his contemporaries understood that part of the reason, the damage that was done in our society, and in particular to African Americans and their psyche, is that they didn't have enough information about the breadth and the depth of their history as African people before enslavement, of the contributions that they've made to this society. And he created a structure through Negro History Week, which was adapted by churches and schools, with a curriculum where they were deliberate not with anybody telling them to do it, but taking it amongst themselves is something that is right and necessary to do, and delivering those lessons. I think it's time that we revisit that spirit of Carter G. Woodson, and think about the ways that we can do for self, not only do for our children, but part of the programs that we offer for South Florida people of color are opportunities for adults to come in and expand the knowledge that they have about the Black experience, about the Latinx experience, about LGBTQI plus experiences, so that we can all have the language, have the understanding, get comfortable with our neighbors and the people who are in the society with us. We are not a monolith. Going back to the good old days may have been good for some, but it was not good for the majority of folks. I say that as first generation in my family, never to have attended a segregated school, and that distance past is not so distant. And so that's the work that we have to do is each of us, wherever we are, in whatever institution we are, whatever place we sit, whether it's individually or working collectively, have to begin to dig in. My fear, though, is that this threat is so subtle that far too few people are really going to appreciate the damage that's being wrought until we're too far down the road.
And that's the fear, right? Like, again, we all used to, I was joking with you earlier before we came on about how when growing up, we had 4 channels, right? It was like ABC, CBS, NBC, and maybe another local channel. I don't even think PBS was in the mix yet. And everybody had the same set of facts and extrapolated their own opinion, which is fine. But when we can't even agree to the basic facts, how are we going to be able to move forward from there? So with that, knowing that we only have a couple minutes left, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to figure out and learn how to follow you, how to get your book, how to learn more about what you're doing, and how to get more involved. So please share how people can find you.
Absolutely. You can learn more about me and follow my work at my website, which is TamekaBradleyHobbs.com. You can learn more about the work that we're doing at Florida Memorial with the Social Justice Institute at our website, socialjustice.fmuniv.edu. If you'd like to learn more about the South Florida people of color and our ongoing array of programs, you can visit southfloridapoc.org and find more there. My books are widely available, but I do like to support our independently owned Black-owned bookstores. So please seek out Pyramid Books, and they are able to provide copies of my book should you be interested in purchasing. But thank you for that opportunity to share, Melba.
Of course. And thank you, Dr. Tameka Hobbs, for coming on Mondays with Melba and really clearing up this foolishness around critical race theory. Everybody, we've got our marching orders. Be sure to educate yourself and push back against this, because if you start teaching inaccurate history or removing people from history, guess what? It starts with Black folks, but it's going to move on to something that you care about too, because there's no boundary. It's a slippery slope. So with that, everyone, have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please like, share, comment, and make sure everyone gets this information. And I will see you next week for another Mondays with Melba. Take good care. Bye.
Keep it going, Melba. You're doing great.
Thank you, Mama.